Chapter 1 of the Opal Serpent. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas. The Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. Chapter 1. Don Quixote in London. Simon Beecot was a country gentleman with a small income, a small estate, and a mind considerably smaller than either. He dwelt at Wargrove in Essex, and spent his idle hours, of which he possessed a daily and nightly 24, in snarling at his faded wife and in snapping between whiles at his son. Mrs. Beecot, having been bullied into old age long before her time, accepted sour looks and hard words as necessary to God's providence, but Paul, a fiery youth, resented useless nagging. He owned more brain power than his progenitor, and to this favoring of nature paterfamilias naturally objected. Paul also desired fame, which was likewise a crime in the fireside tyrant's eyes. As there were no other children, Paul was heir to the Beecot acres. Therefore their present proprietor suggested that his son should wait with idle hands for the falling in of the heritage. In plain words, Mr. Beecot, coming of a long line of middle-class loafers, wished his son to be a loafer also. Again, when Mrs. Beecot retired to a tearful rest, her bully found Paul a useful person on whom to expend his spleen. Should this whipping boy leave, Mr. Beecot would have to forego this enjoyment, as servants object to being sworn at without cause. For years Mr. Beecot indulged in bouts of bad temper, till Paul, finding 25 too dignified of an age to tolerate abuse, announced his intention of storming London as a scribbler. The parents objected in detail. Mrs. Beecroft, after her kind, dissolved in tears, and made reference to the young birds leaving the nest, while her husband, puffed out like a frog, redder than the wattles of a turkey cock, exhausted himself in well-chosen expressions. Paul increased the use of these by fixing a day for his departure. The female Beecot retired to bed with the assistance of a maid, burnt feathers and sal volatile, and the male, as a last and clinging argument, figuratively buttoned up his pockets. "Not 1 shilling will you get from me," said Beecot senior, with the graceful addition of vigorous adjectives. "I don't ask for money," said Paul, keeping his temper, for after all the turkey cock was his father. "I have saved £50, not out of my pocket money," he added hastily, seeing further objections on the way. "I earned it by writing short stories." "The confounded mercantile instinct," snorted paterfamilias, only he used stronger words. "Your mother's uncle was in trade. Thank heaven none of my people ever used hands or brains. The Beecots lived like gentlemen." "I should say like cabbages from your description, father." "No insolence, sir. How dare you disgrace your family? Writing tales, indeed. Rubbish, I expect," and here several adjectives. "And you took money, I'll be bound. Ah!" "I've just informed you that I took all I could get," said Beecot junior, quietly. "I'll live in town on my savings. When I make a name and a fortune I'll return." "Never, never," gobbled the turkey cock. "If you descend to the gutter you can wallow there. I'll cut you out of my will." "Very good, sir. That's settled. Let us change the subject." But the old gentleman was too high-spirited to leave well alone. He demanded to know if Paul knew to whom he was talking, inquired if he had read the Bible touching the duties of children to their parents, instanced the fact that Paul's dear mother would probably pine away and die, and ended with a pathetic reference to losing the prop of his old age. Paul listened respectfully, and held to his own opinion. In defense of the same he replied in detail. "I am aware that I talk to my father, sir," said he, with spirit. "You never allow me to forget that fact. If another man spoke to me as you do, I should probably break his head. I have read the Bible, and find therein that parents owe a duty to their children, which certainly does not include being abused like a pickpocket. My mother will not pine away if you will leave her alone for at least 3 hours a day. And as to my being the prop of your old age, your vigor of language assures me that you are strong enough to stand alone." Paterfamilias, never bearded before, hastily drank a glass of port. The two were enjoying the usual pleasant family meal when the conversation took place, and said, but it is useless to detail his remarks. They were all sound and no sense. In justice to himself and out of pity for his father, Paul cut short the scene by leaving the room with his determination unchanged. Mr. Beecot thereupon retired to bed, and lectured his wife on the enormity of having brought a parricide into the world. Having been countered for once in his life with common sense, he felt that he could not put the matter too strongly to a woman, who was too weak to resent his bullying. Early next day, the cause of the commotion, not having swerved a hair's breadth from the path he had marked out, took leave of his mother and a formal farewell of the gentleman, who described himself as the best of fathers. Beecot senior, turkey cock and tyrant, was more subdued now that he found bluster would not carry his point. But the wave of common sense came too late. Paul departed bag and baggage, and his sire swore to the empty air. Even Mrs. Beecot was not available, as she had fainted. Once Paul was fairly out of the house, paterfamilias announced that the glory of Israel had departed, removed his son's photograph from the drawing room, and considered which of the relatives he had quarreled with should he adopt. Privately, he thought he had been a trifle hard on the lad. But for his obstinacy, which he called firmness, he would have recalled the prodigal. But that enterprising adventurer was beyond hearing, and had left no address behind him. Beecot, the bully, was not a bad old boy if only he had been firmly dealt with. So he acknowledged that Paul had a fine spirit of his own, inherited from himself, and prophesied incorrectly. "He'll come back when the £50 is exhausted," said he, in a kind of dejected rage. "And when he does—" A clenched fist, shaken at nothing, terminated the speech, and showed that the leopard could not change his spots. So Paul Beecot repaired to London, and after the orthodox fashion began to cultivate the muses on a little oatmeal by renting a Bloomsbury garret. There he wrote reams on all subjects and in all styles, and for 6 months assiduously haunted publishers' doors with varying fortunes. Sometimes he came away with a check, but more often with a bulky manuscript bulging his pocket. When tired of settling down imaginary woes, he had time to think of his own. Being a cheerful youth with an indomitable spirit, he banished trouble by interesting himself in the cheap world. By this is meant the world which costs no money to view, the world of the street. Here he witnessed the drama of humanity from morning till night, from sunset till dawn, and on the whole witnessed very good acting. The poorer parts in the human comedy were particularly well played, and starving folks were quite dramatic in their demands for food. Notebook in hand, Paul witnessed spectacular shows in the West End, grotesque farces in the Strand, melodrama in Whitechapel, and tragedy on Waterloo Bridge at midnight. Indeed, he quite spoiled the effect of a sensation scene by tugging at the skirts of a starving heroine who wished to take a river journey into the next world. But for the most part he remained a spectator and plagiarized from real life. Shortly the great manager of the Universal Theater enlisted Paul as an actor, and he assumed the double role of an unappreciated author and a sighing lover. In the first capacity he had in his desk 10 short stories, a couple of novels, 3 dramas, and a sheath of doubtful verse. These failed to appeal to editor, manager, or publisher, and the author found himself reduced to his last £5 note. Then the foolish, ardent lad must needs fall in love. Who his divinity was, what she was, and why she should be divinized can be gathered from a conversation her worshipper had with an old schoolfellow. It was in Oxford Street at 5 o'clock on a June afternoon that Paul met Grexon Hay. Turning the corner of the street leading to his Bloomsbury attic, the author was tapped on the shoulder by a resplendent Bond Street being. That is, the said being wore a perfectly fitting frock coat, a silk hat, trousers with the regulation fold back and front, an orchid buttonhole, gray gloves, boots that glittered, and carried a gold-topped cane. The fact that Paul wheeled without wincing showed that he was not yet in debt. Your Grub Street old-time author would have leaped at his own length at the touch. But Paul, with a clean conscience, turned slowly and gazed without recognition into the clean-shaven, calm, cold face that confronted his inquiring eyes. "Beecot," said the newcomer, taking rapid stock of Paul's shaggy serge suit and worn looks. "I thought I was right." The voice, if not the face, awoke old memories. "Hay, Grexon Hay!" cried the struggling genius. "Well, I am glad to see you." And he shook hands with the frank grip of an honest man. "And I you." Hay drew his friend up the side street and out of the human tide which deluged the pavement. "But you seem—" "It's a long story," interrupted Paul, flushing. "Come to my castle and I'll tell you all about it, old boy. You'll stay to supper, won't you? See here." Paul displayed a parcel. "A pound of sausages. You loved them at school, and I'm a superfine cook." Grexon Hay always used expression and word to hide his feelings. But with Paul, whom he had always considered a generous ass at Torrington School, a trifle of self-betrayal didn't matter much. Beecot was too dense, and, it may be added, too honest to turn any opportunity to advantage. "It's a most surprising thing," said Hay, in his calm way, "really a most surprising thing, that a Torrington public school boy, my friend and the son of wealthy parents, should be buying sausages." "Come now," said Paul, with great spirit, and towing Hay homeward. "I haven't asked you for money." "If you do you shall have it," said Hay, but the offer was not so generous a one as would appear. That was Hay all over. He always said what he did not mean, and he knew well that Beecot's uneasy pride shied at loans however small. Paul, the unsophisticated, took the shadow of generosity for its substance, and his dark face lighted up. "You're a brick, Hay," he declared, "but I don't want money. No." This in reply to an eloquent glance from the well-to-do. "I have sufficient for my needs, and besides, with a look of that resplendent dress of the fashion plate dandy, I don't glitter in the West End." "Which hints that those who do are rich," said Grexon, with an arctic smile. "Wrong, Beecot, I'm poor. Only paupers can afford to dress well." "In that case I must be a millionaire," laughed Beecot, glancing downward at his well-worn garb. "But mount these stairs. We have much to say to one another." "Much that is pleasant," said the courtly Grexon. Paul shrugged his square shoulders and stepped heavenward. "On your part, I hope," he sang back. "Certainly not on mine. Come to Poverty Castle." And the fashionable visitor found his host lighting the fire in an apartment such as he had read about but had never seen. It was quite the proper garret for a starving genius, small, bleak, bare, but scrupulously clean. The floor was partially covered with scraps of old carpet, faded and worn. The walls were entirely papered with pictures from illustrated journals. One window, revealing endless rows of dingy chimney pots, was draped with shabby red curtains of a dull red. In one corner, behind an Indian screen, stood a narrow camp bedstead, covered with a gaudy Eastern shawl, and also a large tin bath, with a can of water beside it. Against the wall leaned the clumsy deal bookcase, filled with volumes well thumbed and in old bindings. On one side of the tiny fireplace was a horsehair sofa, rendered less slippery by an expensive bear rug thrown over its bareness. On the other was a cupboard, whence Beecot rapidly produced crockery, knives, forks, a cruet, napkins, and other table accessories, all of the cheapest description. A deal table in the center of the room, an antique mahogany desk, heaped high with papers, under the window, completed the furnishings of Poverty Castle. And it was up 4 flights of stairs, like the celebrated attic in Thackeray's poem. "As near heaven as I'm likely to get," rattled on Beecot, deftly frying the sausage after placing his visitor on the sofa. "The grub will soon be ready. I'm a first-class cook. Bless you, old chap. Housemaid, too. Clean, eh?" He waved the fork proudly round the ill-furnished room. "I'd dismiss myself if it wasn't." But, stammered Hay, much amazed, and surveying things through an eyeglass, "what are you doing here?" "Trying to get my foot on the first rung of Fame's ladder." "But I don't quite see." "Read Balzac's life, and you will. His people gave him an attic and a starvation allowance in the hope of disgusting him. Bar the allowance, my pater has done the same. Here's the attic, and here's my starvation." Paul gaily popped the frizzling sausages on a chipped hot plate. "And here's your aspiring servant, hoping to be novelists, dramatists, and what not, to say nothing of why not. Mustard, there you are. Wait a bit. I'll brew you tea or cocoa." "I never take those things with meals, Beecot." "Your kit assures me of that. Champagne's more in your line, I say. Grexon, what are you doing now?" "What other West End men do," said Grexon, attacking a sausage. "That means nothing. Well, you never did work at Torrington, so how can I expect the leopard to change his saucy spots?" Hay laughed, and during the meal explained his position. "On leaving school I was adopted by a rich uncle," he said. "When he went the way of all flesh, he left me $1,000 a year, which is enough to live on with strict economy. I have rooms in Alexander Street, Camden Hill, a circle of friends, and a good appetite, as you will perceive. With these I get through life very comfortably." "Ha," said Paul, darting a keen glance at his visitor. "You have the strong digestion necessary to happiness. Have you the hard heart also? If I remember at school—" "Oh, hang school," said Grexon, flushing all over his cold face. "I never think of school. I was glad when I got away from it. But we were great friends at school, Paul." "Something after the style of Steerforth and David Copperfield," was Paul's reply, as he pushed back his plate. "You were my hero, and I was your slave. But the other boys," he looked again, "they hated me because they did not understand me as you did." "If that is so, Grexon, why did you let me slip out of your life? It is 10 years since we parted. I was 15 and you 20." "Which now makes us 25 and 30 respectively," said Hay, dryly. "You left school before I did." "Yes, I had scarlet fever, and was taken home to be nursed. I never went back, and since then I have never met an old Torrington boy." "Have you not?" asked Hay, eagerly. "No, my parents took me abroad, and I sampled a German university.
I returned to idle about my father's place till I grew sick of doing nothing, and having ambitions, I came to try my luck in town." He looked round and laughed. "You see my luck." "Well," said Hay, lighting a dainty cigarette produced from a gold case, "my uncle who died sent me to Oxford, and then I travelled. I am now on my own, as I told you, and haven't a relative in the world." "Why don't you marry?" asked Paul with a flush. Hay, wary man about town as he was, noted the flush, and guessed its cause. He could put two and two together as well as most people. "I might ask you the same question," said he. The two friends looked at one another, and each thought of the difference in his companion since the old school days. Hay was clean shaven, fair haired, and calm, almost icy in manner. His eyes were blue and cold. No one could tell what was passing in his mind from the expression of his face. As a matter of fact, he usually wore a mask, but at the present moment, better feelings having the upper hand, the mask had slipped a trifle. But as a rule, he kept command of expression and words and actions. An admirable example of self-control was Grexon Hay. On the other hand, Beecot was slight, tall and dark, with an eager manner and a face which revealed his thoughts. His complexion was swart. He had large black eyes, a sensitive mouth, and a small mustache smartly twisted upward. He carried his head well, and looked rather military in appearance, probably because many of his forebears had been army men. While Hay was smartly dressed in a Bond Street kit, Paul wore a well-cut, shabby blue serge. He looked perfectly well bred, but his clothes were woefully threadbare. From these and the garret and the lean meal of sausages, Hay drew his conclusions and put them into words. "Your father has cut you off," said he, calmly, "and yet you propose to marry." "How do you know both things?" "I keep my eyes open, Paul. I see this attic and your clothes. I saw also the flush on your face when you asked me why I did not marry. You are in love." "I am," said Beecot, becoming scarlet and throwing back his head. "It is clever of you to guess it. Prophesy more." Hay smiled in a cold way. "I prophesy that if you marry on nothing you will be miserable. But of course," he looked sharply at his open-faced friend, "the lady may be rich." "She is the daughter of a second-hand bookseller called Norman, and I believe he combines selling books with pawnbroking." Said Hay. "He might make money out of the last occupation. Is he a Jew by any chance?" "No, he is a miserable looking, one-eyed Christian, with the manner of a frightened rabbit." "One-eyed and frightened," repeated Hay, musingly, but without change of expression. "Desirable father-in-law. And the daughter?" "Sylvia. She is an angel, a white lily, a " "Of course," said Grexon, cutting short these rhapsodies. "And what do you intend to marry on?" Beecot fished a shabby blue velvet case out of his pocket. "On my last £5 and this," he said, opening the case. Hay looked at the contents of the case and saw a rather large brooch made in the form of a jewelled serpent. "Opals, diamonds, and gold," he said slowly, then looked up eagerly. "Sell it to me." Chapter 2